On certain large planets, whose climates, owing to the proximity of a violent sun, were much hotter than our tropics, we sometimes found an intelligent fish-like race. It was bewildering for us to discover that a submarine world could rise to mentality of human rank, and to that drama of the spirit, which we had now so often encountered. The very shallow and sun-drenched oceans of these great planets provided an immense diversity of habitats and a great wealth of living beings. Green vegetation, which could be classified as tropical, subtropical, temperate, and arctic, basked on the bright ocean floors. There were submarine prairies and forests. In some regions, the giant weeds stretched from the sea bottom to the waves. In the jungles, the blue and blinding light of the sun was reduced almost to darkness. Immense coral-like growths, honeycombed with passages and swarming with all manner of live things, lifted their spires and turrets to the surface. Innumerable kinds of fish-like creatures of all sizes, from sprat to whale, inhabited the many levels of the waters, some gliding on the bottom, some daring an occasional leap into the torrid air. In the deepest and darkest regions, hosts of sea monsters, eyeless or luminous, browsed on the ceaseless rain of corpses which sank from the upper levels. Over their deep world lay other worlds of increasing brightness and color, where gaudy populations basked, browsed, stalked, or hunted with arrowy flight. Intelligence in these planets was generally achieved by some unimposing social creature, neither fish nor octopus nor crustacean, but something of all three. It would be equipped with manipulatory tentacles, keen eyes, and subtle brain. It would make nests of weed in the crevices of the coral, or build strongholds of coral masonry. In time would appear traps, weapons, tools, submarine agriculture, the blossoming of primitive art, the ritual of primitive religion. Then would follow the typical fluctuating advance of the spirit from barbarism to civilization. One of these submarine worlds was exceptionally interesting. Early in the life of our galaxy, when few of the stars had yet condensed from the giant to the solar type, when few planetary births had yet occurred, a double star and a single star in a congested cluster did actually approach one another, reach fiery filaments towards one another, and spawn a planet brood. Of these worlds, one, an immense and very aqueous sphere, produced in time a dominant race which was not a single species, but an intimate symbiotic partnership of two very alien creatures. The one came of a fish-like stock. The other was in appearance something like a crustacean. In form it was a sort of paddle-footed crab or marine spider. Unlike our crustaceans, it was covered not with a brittle carapace, but with a tough pachydermatous hide. In maturity, this serviceable jerkin was more or less rigid, save at the joints, but in youth it was very pliant to the still expanding brain. This creature lived on the coasts and in the coastal waters of the many islands of the planet. Both species were mentally of human rank, though each had specific temperament and ability. In primitive times each had attained by its own route and in its own hemisphere of the great aqueous planet to what might be called the last stage of the subhuman mentality. The two species had then come into contact and had grappled desperately. Their battleground was the shallow coastal water. The crustaceans, though crudely amphibian, could not spend long under the sea. The fish could not emerge from it. The two races did not seriously compete with one another in economic life, for the fish were mainly vegetarian, the crustaceans mainly carnivorous, yet neither could tolerate the presence of the other. Both were sufficiently human to be aware of one another as rival aristocrats in a subhuman world, but neither was human enough to realize that for each race the way of life lay in cooperation with the other. The fish-like creatures, which I shall call ichthyoids, had speed and range of travel. They had also the security of bulk. The crab-like or spider-like crustaceans, which I shall call arachnoids, had greater manual dexterity, and had also access to the dry land. Cooperation would have been very beneficial to both species, for one of the staple foods of the arachnoids was parasitic to the ichthyoids. In spite of the possibility of mutual aid, the two races strove to exterminate one another, and almost succeeded. After an age of blind mutual slaughter, certain of the less pugnacious and more flexible varieties of the two species gradually discovered profit in fraternization with the enemy. This was the beginning of a very remarkable partnership. Soon the arachnoids took to riding on the backs of the swift ichthyoids, and thus gained access to more remote hunting grounds. As the epochs passed, the two species molded one another to form a well-integrated union. The little arachnoid, no bigger than a chimpanzee, rode in a snug hollow behind the great fish's skull, his back being streamlined with the contours of the larger creature. The tentacles of the ichthyoid were specialized for large-scale manipulation, those of the arachnoid for minute work. A biochemical interdependence also evolved. Through a membrane in the ichthyoid's pouch, an exchange of endocrine products took place. The mechanism enabled the arachnoid to become fully aquatic. So long as it had frequent contact with its host, it could stay underwater for any length of time and descend to any depth. A striking mental adaptation also occurred in the two species. The ichthyoids became on the whole more introvert, the arachnoids more extrovert. Up to puberty, the young of both species were free-living individuals, but, as their symbiotic organization developed, each sought out a partner of the opposite species. The union which followed was lifelong, and was interrupted only by brief sexual matings. The symbiosis itself constituted a kind of contrapuntal sexuality, but a sexuality that was purely mental, since, of course, for copulation and reproduction, each individual had to seek out a partner belonging to his or her own species. We found, however, that even the symbiotic partnership consisted invariably of a male of one species and a female of the other, and the male, whichever his species, behaved with parental devotion to the young of his symbiotic partner. I have not space to describe the extraordinary mental reciprocity of these strange couples. I can only say that, though in sensory equipment and in temperament the two species were very different, and though in abnormal cases tragic conflicts did occur, the ordinary partnership was at once more intimate than human marriage and far more enlarging to the individual than any friendship between members of distinct human races. At certain stages of the growth of civilization, malicious minds had attempted to arouse widespread interspecific conflict and had met with temporary success, but the trouble seldom went as deep even as our sex war, so necessary was each species to the other. Both had contributed equally to the culture of the world, though not equally at all times. In creative work of every kind, one of the partners provided most of the originality, the other most of the criticism and restraint. Work in which one partner was entirely passive was rare. On the whole, the arachnoid partners dominated in manual skill, experimental science, the plastic arts, and practical social organization. The ichthyoid partners excelled in theoretical work, in literary arts, in the surprisingly developed music of that submarine world, and in the more mystical kind of religion. This generalization, however, should not be interpreted very strictly. The symbiotic relationship seems to have given the dual race a far greater mental flexibility than ours, and a quicker aptitude for community. It passed rapidly through the phase of intertribal strife, during which the nomadic shoals of symbiotic couples harried one another like hosts of submarine cavalry. For the arachnoids, riding their ichthyoid mates, attacked the enemy with bones, spears, and swords, while their mounts wrestled with powerful tentacles. But the phase of tribal warfare was remarkably brief. When a settled mode of life was attained, along with submarine agriculture and coral-built cities, strife between leagues of cities was the exception, not the rule. Aided no doubt by its great mobility and ease of communication, the dual race soon built up a world-wide and unarmed federation of cities. We learned also with wonder that at the height of the pre-mechanical civilization of this planet, when in our worlds the cleavage into masters and economic slaves would have already become serious, the communal spirit of the city triumphed over all individualistic enterprise. Very soon this world became a tissue of independent but interdependent municipal communes. At this time it seemed that social strife had vanished forever, but the most serious crisis of the race was still to come. The submarine environment offered the symbiotic race no great possibilities of advancement. All sources of wealth had been tapped and regularized. Population was maintained at an optimum size for the joyful working of the world. The social order was satisfactory to all classes, and seemed unlikely to change. Individual lives were full and varied. Culture, founded on a great tradition, was now concerned entirely with detailed exploration of the great fields of thought that had long ago been pioneered by the revered ancestors, under direct inspiration, it was said, of the symbiotic deity. Our friends in this submarine world, our mental hosts, looked back on this age from their own more turbulent epoch, sometimes with yearning but often with horror, for in retrospect it seemed to them to display the first faint signs of racial decay. So perfectly did the race fit in its unchanging environment that its intelligence and acuity were already ceasing to be precious, and might soon begin to fade. But presently it appeared that fate had decreed otherwise. In a submarine world, the possibility of obtaining mechanical power was remote, but the arachnoids, it will be remembered, were able to live out of the water. In the epochs before the symbiosis, their ancestors had periodically emerged upon the islands for courtship, parenthood, and the pursuit of prey. Since those days, the air-breathing capacity had declined, but it had never been entirely lost. Every arachnoid still emerged for sexual mating, and also for certain ritual gymnastic exercises. It was in this latter connection that the great discovery was made which changed the course of history. At a certain tournament, the friction of stone weapons clashing against one another produced sparks and fire among the sun-scorched grasses. In startlingly quick succession came smelting, the steam engine, the electric current. Power was obtained first from the combustion of a sort of peat formed on the coasts by congested marine vegetation, later from the constant and violent winds, later still from phytochemical light traps which absorbed the sun's lavish radiation. These inventions were of course the work of the arachnoids. The ichthyoids, though they still played a great part in the systematization of knowledge, were debarred from the great practical work of scientific experiment and mechanical invention above the seas. Soon the arachnoids were running electric cables from the island power stations to the submarine cities. In this work at least the ichthyoids could take part, but their part was necessarily subordinate. Not only in experience of electrical engineering, but also in native practical ability, they were eclipsed by their arachnoid partners. For a couple of centuries or more, the two species continued to cooperate, though with increasing strain. Artificial lighting, mechanical transport of goods on the ocean floor, and large-scale manufacture produced an immense increase in the amenities of life in the submarine cities. The islands were crowded with buildings devoted to science and industry. Physics, chemistry, and biology made great progress. Astronomers began to map the galaxy. They also discovered that a neighboring planet offered wonderful opportunities for settlement by arachnoids, who might, without great difficulty, it was hoped, be conditioned to the alien climate, and a divorce from their symbiotic partners. The first attempts at rocket flight were leading to mingled tragedy and success. The Directorate of Extramarine Activities demanded a much increased arachnoid population.